On August 23, 1942, at 3:18 p.m., the most brutal fire Europe had seen since the beginning of the war began. German bombs rained down on Stalingrad for hours, reducing the entire city to ash, smoke, and screams trapped beneath the rubble. There were no safe havens. There was no time to flee. For 5 months, soldiers and civilians shared the same hell. Burning ruins, frozen bodies, hallucinations from hunger, amputations without anesthesia, and friendly fire. When there were no more bullets, they fought with shovels, knives, or their bare hands. Those who tried to flee were riddled with bullets by their own army. Those who stayed were left to rot alive. What brutal acts did the German soldiers commit? What orders did the Soviet commanders receive after the bombing? What horrors were committed to survive? Fire from the sky, the bombing of Stalingrad. Before the fighting began in the streets, Stalingrad was already burning. What was supposed to be a Soviet fortress city was first turned into a fire trap from the air. This wasn't a conventional bombing raid. It was a systematic operation of total devastation launched by Luftflotte 4 under the command of General Wolfram von Richthofen. In just a few hours, the cityscape changed irreparably. The city was attacked by more than 1,500 combat sorties in a single day. German bombers dropped nearly 1,000 tons of explosives and incendiary charges on a densely populated urban area, tripling the force used against Rotterdam just 2 years earlier. The initial objectives were military, but the nature of the attack, its volume and intensity, produced unparalleled destruction. What began as a tactical assault quickly turned into urban extermination. The northern and central neighborhoods, built mostly of wood, were razed to the ground in minutes. Incendiary bombs, many of which were loaded with phosphorus, ignited fires that couldn't be extinguished. Most containment systems collapsed within the first hour. The high-powered bombs brought down roofs, walls, and entire basements, burying thousands of people beneath them. From 70 kilometers away, witnesses observed a column of smoke nearly 3 kilometers high rise above the horizon. It was the direct result of a strategy of annihilation that, beyond the physical impact, aimed to break the city's will before the German Sixth Army entered. One of the hardest-hit targets was the central railway station, key to Soviet logistics movements. However, the lack of precision in the high-altitude launches meant that schools, hospitals, and bomb shelters received direct hits. Water lines burst, electricity was cut off, and communications were knocked out in a matter of hours. Emergency trucks that survived the initial bombing were unable to move forward. The streets had been transformed into a field of craters. Data on civilian casualties were disputed from the outset. Soviet authorities downplayed the impact. But subsequent reports from the NKVD and the Military Council estimated between 40,000 and 70,000 dead in the first 3 days. This is one of the highest figures for civilian deaths from bombing in modern military history. Paradoxically, the plan designed to weaken Soviet resistance had the opposite effect. The ruins not only failed to facilitate the German advance, but created the ideal setting for brutal urban warfare. The collapsed factories, underground tunnels, the remains of homes and sewers became natural defensive positions. From that moment on, Stalingrad ceased to be a city. It became a trap for the invader. The last major air raid occurred on August 27th. Another 300 tons of explosives were dropped. By then, the German High Command had already declared Stalingrad a dead zone. But within that zone, hundreds of thousands of civilians and combatants remained. The city was still burning, and the worst was yet to come. Hell among the ruins, hand-to-hand combat in the destroyed city. The transformation of Stalingrad into a wasteland of rubble fundamentally altered the very nature of warfare. Traditional battlefield tactics became obsolete as combat descended into a primitive struggle for survival in a labyrinth of ruins. The urban combat that developed during the battle reached a level of ferocity unprecedented in modern warfare. The Soviets implemented what they called micro-defense tactics. Buildings were fortified floor by floor, with each level functioning as an independent defensive position. Soldiers created internal passages through walls, allowing movement between rooms and buildings without exposure to the streets. These rat highways allowed Soviet troops to launch surprise attacks, redeploy forces, or ambush attackers from unexpected angles. According to Soviet military documents, the defenders made extensive use of improvised explosive devices, grenades rigged to doors, mines hidden under floorboards, and explosive charges attached to everyday objects. A single German advance through a building could trigger multiple booby traps, inflicting heavy casualties in confined spaces where evacuation was nearly impossible. Certain locations became particularly notorious killing zones. Mamayev Kurgan, a strategic hill overlooking much of the urban front, changed hands at least 14 times between September and November 1942. Post-war excavations revealed more than 34,000 bodies in this area alone, most bearing signs of death from close-range gunfire, grenade fragmentation, or direct explosions. Industrial sectors, particularly the Dzerzhinsky tractor factory, the Red October steel plant, and the Barricades factory, became apocalyptic battlegrounds. These massive industrial complexes, with their network of tunnels, basements, and heavy machinery, offered countless defensive positions. Germans who captured a section of a factory often found themselves under attack from Soviet forces holding adjacent workshops or upper floors. Close-quarters combat within the devastated landscape of Stalingrad promoted the systematic use of weapons designed for annihilation in close quarters. One of the most terrifying examples was the German 305th Regiment's employment of flamethrowers during the October offensive, particularly in industrial sectors where basements, corridors, and tunnels facilitated Soviet ambushes. The Flammenwerfer 35 and its successor, the Model 41, were used to clear underground shelters, causing uncontrollable fires in already partially collapsed buildings. Soviet witnesses reported scenes where fire spread through beams soaked with industrial grease, turning entire factories into hellish traps. The Soviets, for their part, deployed 82mm mortars and short-range cannons from inside civilian structures, taking advantage of their knowledge of the terrain. This tactic allowed them to attack German positions without exposing gunners, but increased the risk of crossfire. Poor communications and near-zero visibility in the ruins led to deadly friendly fire incidents. At the Red October factory, a unit of the Soviet 112th Regiment was mistakenly shelled by its own artillery after an unreported shift in the front line. The explosion of 4 high-yield shells killed 93 men in less than 2 minutes. These incidents were not exceptional. Reports from the 62nd Army document that between October and December there were at least 42 serious friendly fire incidents, both due to misidentification and radio frequency interference. In the midst of a war where the enemy could be mere meters away, the line between error and tragedy became increasingly thin. The burning factories showed no distinction between sides, only charred bodies beneath the twisted beams. Combat distances were reduced to mere meters. Reports from the German 24th Panzer Division and 389th Infantry Division described encounters where the enemies could hear each other breathing. During a German offensive from October 13th to 18th, more than 3,000 casualties occurred within the perimeter of the tractor factory alone. The subsequent Soviet counterattack, which recaptured parts of the building, resulted in another 2,200 casualties. The confined nature of urban combat forced adaptations. When ammunition was scarce, soldiers resorted to primitive weapons. Soviet medical reports documented deaths caused by construction tools, shovels, hammers, and iron bars. Soviet assault units and penal battalions often conducted attacks where physical contact with the enemy became the only viable option after exhausting ammunition. Field autopsies performed by Soviet medical services revealed bodies with multiple knife wounds to the chest and abdomen, signs of manual strangulation, fractured bones from blunt force trauma, and dismemberment. In approximately 7% of the cases analyzed, deaths occurred in unarmed confrontations. The intensity of the fighting made it almost impossible to recover the fallen. The commander of the German 11th Army Corps, General Karl Strecker, wrote in January 1943, "Our dead become part of the terrain. There is no longer any separation between the ground and the human remains. Bodies piled up in streets, stairwells, and factory floors, creating physical barriers that combatants used as cover. In many areas, corpses were piled more than a meter high. German military propaganda photographers documented trenches formed with sandbags and frozen bodies used as parapets in exposed areas. This macabre use of the dead, while not a systematic policy, arose from the impossibility of proper burial or evacuation. The continued presence of decomposing bodies contributed to the spread of disease. Typhus, dysentery, and septicemia were detected throughout the urban front, according to reports from Army Group South's medical department. The psychological impact on the surviving soldiers was devastating, creating a battlefield where the living existed alongside constant reminders of death. This radically new form of warfare created its own vocabulary among combatants. Soviet soldiers referred to small combat groups as hunting groups, while the Germans called the battle Rattenkrieg, rat war. Soviet assault units developed specialized techniques. The Stalingrad Minute involved a coordinated 60-second assault from multiple directions, designed to confuse German units in confined spaces. Soviet General Chuikov implemented the concept of active defense, which involved constant small-scale counterattacks to prevent the Germans from consolidating positions. This tactic took advantage of intimate knowledge of urban terrain, where a building captured during the day could be infiltrated and recaptured during the night. The result was a fluid front, where battle lines shifted by meters, not kilometers, and where seemingly secure positions could become death traps in a matter of hours. The human component of this urban combat exceeded the normal limits of endurance. Soldiers on both sides fought under conditions of extreme exhaustion, sleep deprivation, and hunger. First-hand accounts describe combatants who went without sleep for days, subsisted on minimal rations, and suffered infections from minor wounds that became gangrenous in the unsanitary environment of the ruins. Ammunition shortages in Stalingrad reached critical levels beginning in October 1942, exacerbating the desperate and brutal nature of urban combat. Both reports from the Soviet 62nd Army and those from the German 6th Army agree that ammunition supplies could not keep up with the daily attrition. In many sectors of the front, soldiers were instructed to fire only in situations of absolute certainty, which meant in practice conserving every bullet as if it were their last. A Soviet logistics report dated November 3rd noted that the average consumption of individual ammunition had dropped to less than 5 rounds per day per combatant. This situation forced extreme adaptation. Troops began reusing enemy weapons, Germans wielding Soviet PP-41 submachine guns, Soviets firing Kar-98K rifles or Luger pistols scavenged from corpses. This chaotic mix of weapons led to tactical confusion and even cases of friendly fire in night engagements or inside collapsed structures. Furthermore, cases of deliberate sabotage were documented. Enemy ammunition rigged to misfire or explode inside the weapon, intentionally inserted among magazines abandoned by retreating squads. The need for weapons also led to the proliferation of homemade devices. Using tin cans, rusty nails, gunpowder extracted from flares, and metal fragments, Soviet sappers crafted improvised grenades known as death bottles, whose range and reliability were limited but sufficient in close quarters. Some soldiers stored explosive charges in boots or backpacks, ready to be activated in the event of close-quarters combat. In this extreme environment, the line between soldier and improviser blurred. Survival required not only resilience but lethal creativity. By the end of October, the battle for Stalingrad had evolved into a bloody stalemate where progress was measured in individual rooms and floors of buildings. In this shattered cityscape, the labels of victory or defeat lost their conventional meaning. There was only immediate survival or death as the city continued to devour both armies in its labyrinth of ruins. Hunters among the ruins, Soviet snipers in Stalingrad. In the ruined streets of Stalingrad, a silent threat became one of the most destabilizing factors for German troops, Soviet snipers. They didn't operate in large groups or make any noise. They moved through collapsed stairwells, improvised tunnels, and towering ruins. They watched for hours, and they fired once. The sniper organization was a direct response to urban combat. Red Army divisions deployed pairs consisting of a shooter and an observer. They used Mosin Nagant M9130 rifles equipped with 3.5 by PEM optical sights. Ammunition was scarce, so each shot was fired only with a clear line of sight and observer confirmation. The most famous was Vasily Zaitsev, a member of the 284th Rifle Division. His service record, preserved in the archives of the Russian Ministry of Defense, records more than 225 enemy kills between October and December 1942, including 11 German snipers. His main field of operations was the Mamayev-Kurgan sector and the area between the central station and the Volga River. Zaitsev trained a small group of snipers known as the Stalingrad School, who operated in mobile pairs across different sectors of the city. It is estimated that this network caused more than 1,000 casualties among troops of the German Sixth Army. One of his students, Viktor Medvedev, was credited with 83 confirmed kills. Internal reports indicate they operated from civilian structures, destroyed towers, abandoned vehicles, and factory ventilation shafts. The conditions were extreme. The cold forced them to remain motionless for hours, even with frozen limbs. No radios were used. Orders were transmitted by direct contact or visual signals. In some cases, snipers spent 2 full days in the same hiding place without sleep to maintain control over key corridors or avenues. The psychological effect on the German troops was immediate. Reports from the German 24th Army Corps mention the impossibility of advancing more than 100 meters without suffering casualties from precision fire. In areas such as the barricade factory or the approaches to the central station, movement was paralyzed for days due to the absolute visual control of the Soviet snipers. The German response was the formation of sniper teams, which used long-range binoculars and baiting tactics. In many cases, a soldier would volunteer to cross a street in worn uniform, feigning vulnerability. The objective was to detect the flash of Soviet gunfire and respond with immediate fire from at least 2 flanking positions. This tactic eliminated several snipers, but also caused numerous German casualties due to miscalculations. There were also female snipers in Stalingrad. Among the most recognized were Nina Pavlyuchenkova and Tanya Chernova, both trained at military academies before the conflict. Chernova operated on the same team as Zaitsev for several weeks. Trapped civilians, hunger and death under the rubble. While military forces clashed among the ruins, a parallel and less visible tragedy unfolded underground. Thousands of civilians, women, children and the elderly, were trapped in a city turned into a battlefield. Their story of survival represents one of the most harrowing chapters of the Battle of Stalingrad. When the siege began, approximately 400,000 civilians remained in the city. The late and incomplete evacuation, ordered only after the bombing began, meant that tens of thousands were trapped as the Germans cut off western escape routes. By October 1942, the surviving civilians sought refuge primarily in cellars, service tunnels, and makeshift underground structures throughout the shattered cityscape. The conditions in these shelters were indescribable. NKVD reports documenting the civilian situation described unventilated spaces where up to 50 people were crammed into rooms designed for storage. The lack of sanitary facilities quickly led to outbreaks of disease. Basements featured makeshift pits for basic human needs, which, given the impossibility of regular emptying, became hotbeds of infection. Dysentery, tuberculosis, and pneumonia spread rapidly in these underground environments, especially among children and the elderly. Even worse was the systematic starvation that affected the civilian population. As the noose tightened, rations were constantly reduced. By December 1942, the daily allowance for civilians had fallen to 125 grams of bread per person, roughly the equivalent of 2 slices, made mainly from substitutes such as sawdust, crushed seeds, and beet pulp. Records from the Civil Defense Committee show that during the harshest winter months, most civilians consumed fewer than 700 calories a day, 1/3 of what was needed to maintain normal bodily functions. The desperate search for food led to extreme situations. Initially classified NKVD reports, declassified decades later, document cases of consumption of boiled shoe and belt leather or broth made with animal bone glue. In the tunnels beneath the Red October factory, a group of 76 workers and their families survived for 3 weeks by consuming industrial oil mixed with flour residue. The medical consequences were devastating: mass poisoning, liver failure, and deaths from multiple organ failure. Normal social divisions disintegrated under these extreme conditions. Soviet military police reports document cases of violent robbery among civilians for small amounts of food. An entry from the diary of political commissar Ivan Lazarev, dated December 7, 1942, describes finding a woman of about 50 years old strangled in a cellar near the central station, with her 200 grams of bread ration stolen. Such incidents became so common that special NKVD units were assigned to guard food distribution points. The psychological trauma among the trapped civilians was profound and long-lasting, manifesting itself especially severely in the most vulnerable. Soviet military doctors documented shelter syndrome, characterized by a paralyzing fear of open spaces, regressive behavior, and selective mutism, particularly in children who had spent months in near-total darkness. Medical records reveal that many developed selective blindness or functional deafness as a defensive mechanism. This situation was even more devastating for mothers with young children, with an infant mortality rate exceeding 75% during the winter of 1942-43. Mothers weakened by malnutrition were unable to produce sufficient breast milk, while a lack of suitable substitutes resulted in mass deaths from starvation, as shown by recovered diaries describing desperate attempts to feed babies boiled paper pulp or bark extracts. The traditional family structure collapsed under the extreme pressure of the siege. The archives of the Stalingrad Front's Department of Social Affairs document numerous cases of abandonment of elderly people considered useless mouths when food became extremely scarce. These cases of forced family selection represented additional psychological traumas that would persist long after the end of the battle. By January 1943, when the Soviet counteroffensive began, the surviving civilians had spent more than 5 months in subhuman conditions. Medical reports from the Soviet 62nd Army note that many showed signs of advanced scurvy, pellagra, and rickets due to severe and prolonged vitamin deficiencies. The medical teams who first entered the civilian shelters after the liberation described ghostly figures, barely recognizable as human, with extreme muscle loss and profound apathy. Despite the devastation, there were notable acts of solidarity and heroism among the civilian population. Military records document the existence of makeshift basement schools where teachers continued to educate small groups of children using charcoal to write on walls like blackboards. On the west bank of the Volga, a clandestine network of civilian fishermen regularly risked their lives to bring small quantities of fresh fish to shelters housing mostly children. Liberation brought its own challenges. Many survivors developed what Soviet doctors called liberated man syndrome, characterized by an inability to adapt to normal conditions after months of underground existence. Reports from evacuation hospitals describe patients refusing to sleep in beds, preferring to eat in the dark, or secretly hoarding food to the point of putrefaction for fear of future periods of hunger. The price paid by Stalingrad's civilians rarely figures prominently in historical accounts of the battle, but it represents one of the most tragic dimensions of this chapter of World War II. The physical and psychological scars persisted for generations, while the experiences of survival under impossible conditions redefined medical understanding of collective trauma and human resilience. Armed children in Stalingrad, 14-year-old fighters. Among the most extreme events that occurred during the Battle of Stalingrad was the appearance of minors in combat roles. Children as young as 12 and 14 years old took up arms, transported ammunition, or acted as liaisons between Red Army units. They were not formally recruited by military structures. They joined spontaneously after losing their families and refusing to leave the besieged city. Valia, 14-year-old Zenkina, served as a courier in the 10th Rifle Regiment. She delivered communications between command posts in the Red October factory district, crossing streets under direct fire. On November 19, 1942, she was hit by shrapnel in the leg while trying to pass between 2 destroyed buildings. Her evacuation, treatment, and subsequent transfer to a rear medical facility were recorded in the admissions book of Medical Unit Number 23rd. She survived and was awarded the 1943 Medal for the Defense of Stalingrad, one of the few children so formally recognized. Vasya Kurka, born in 1929, served as a guide for Soviet artillery units on Mamayev Kurgan. He knew routes through ruins, tunnels, and cellars that allowed him to move between firing points without being exposed to German snipers. According to reports kept at the Battle of Stalingrad Panorama Museum, Kurka accompanied artillery observers to identify enemy positions. In December, he was wounded by a mortar blast, causing partial hearing loss and permanent damage to one arm. He was evacuated on December 28 by the 62nd Army's medical unit. On January 4, 1943, an internal report from the 62nd Army General Staff recorded the presence of more than 20 visually identified miners performing active military duties in the northern industrial sectors. Some transported incendiary bottles, ammunition, water, or black bread to defensive positions. Others acted as liaisons between company commands or as guides through collapsed corridors and tunnels. They were not officially incorporated into the units, but operated alongside adult soldiers under fire without regulation uniforms or rank. Leonid Golikov, 14, was an orphan who volunteered at the barricades factory. His job was to drag crates of hand grenades and rifle cartridges from a makeshift warehouse to a machine gun position on the second floor of a partially destroyed structure. During a bombardment, he was hit by German artillery. The Russian State Military Archive, RGVA archives, hold his surgical report, which documents the traumatic amputation of his right leg. He was evacuated to a hospital in Saratov, where he spent 2 months recovering. Yevgeny's photographic archives, Kaldai, a Soviet war reporter assigned to the Stalingrad front, features a photo taken on January 18, 1943, near the railway station. In it, a boy with a thin face and an oversized hat is holding a Mosin Nagant rifle resting on the ground. The photograph was published weeks later in the magazine Ogonyok with the caption, "One of Our Little Defenders." The image became one of the few confirmed visual records of armed miners during the battle. Field Dr. Mikhail Avilov, in charge of Field Hospital No. 42, recorded in his medical notebook that between November 1942 and January 1943, he treated 7 seriously injured children, all boys between the ages of 12 and 15. Their injuries included severe frostbite, fractures caused by explosions, and gunshot wounds. The document, now housed at the Institute of Military History in Moscow, contains precise clinical notes on the place of discovery, approximate age, and circumstances of each admission. 2 of the 7 died in the first few days. Yuri Rubtsov, born in 1928, was interviewed in 2005 by the People's Memory of the Great Patriotic War Project, sponsored by the Russian Ministry of Defense. He stated that at the age of 14, he joined a group of armed civilian workers in the barricades plant area. He was responsible for cleaning corridors, sorting live ammunition, collecting rifles from corpses, and transporting cans of water from a point on the Volga River under constant fire. His testimony was verified by school records, certifying his withdrawal from the education system between September 1942 and May 1943. Records from the Stalingrad front and medical reports from the State Defense Committee estimate that at least 40 to 60 miners were wounded, maimed, or killed while performing military duties between September 1942 and February 1943. None of them appear on formal lists of regular soldiers. Most were buried without identification, along with the adult casualties. In Stalingrad, anyone who could carry a weapon or cross a corridor without collapsing was employed. Among the frozen rubble, children also fought hand-to-hand, threw grenades, or acted as lookouts. They did so without training, without protection, and in many cases without supervision. The archives name them precisely: age, wound, impact zone. They were there, armed, and they died like soldiers. The Red Terror, executions and punishments within the Soviet army itself. On July 28, 1942, as the German armies advanced towards Stalingrad, Joseph Stalin signed one of the most ruthless orders in Soviet military history. Order 227, known for its opening phrase, "Not one step back," logically established a repressive system designed to eliminate any possibility of retreat among Soviet troops. This directive transformed the front lines into a space where soldiers faced not only the German enemy, but also the constant threat of their own officers and special units of the NKVD. The order established a ruthless system with 3 main components: armed blocking detachments positioned behind combat units to shoot those who retreated, the creation of penal battalions, Strafbats, where cowardly soldiers would be sent on suicide missions, and field military tribunals with the authority to summarily execute anyone suspected of cowardice or desertion. The execution of this order in Stalingrad was particularly severe. Documents from the Russian State Military Archive reveal that between July and October 1942, NKVD blocking detachments on the Stalingrad front arrested 140,755 soldiers. Of these, 3,980 were shot on the spot, and more than 60,000 were sent to penal corps. These figures, considered conservative by modern historians, represent only officially recorded executions. The operation of these blocking detachments has been widely documented. Positioned approximately 200 meters behind the front line, these special NKVD units were equipped primarily with Maxim heavy machine guns aimed at their own troops, not the enemy. An NKVD report dated September 20th, 1942, describes how during a German attack on the northern sector of the city, Blocking Detachment 38 opened fire on a group of approximately 115 soldiers who were leaving positions without authorization, killing 21 and forcing the rest to return to their positions. Penal battalions constituted another dimension of the repressive system. Comprised of soldiers considered politically suspicious or guilty of minor infractions, these units were assigned to the most dangerous missions. According to Soviet Ministry of Defense documents between August 1942 and February 1943, approximately 30,000 soldiers were sent to penal battalions in the Stalingrad sector alone. These units suffered a casualty rate of 80% in their first combat action. The primary function of these battalions was to serve as cannon fodder. Operational reports from the 62nd Army describe how they were used to clear minefields by advancing in line without detectors, to conduct reconnaissance of fortified positions without support, or to draw enemy fire and reveal machine gun emplacements. A Stalingrad Front General Staff document dated October 12, 1942, orders the commander of a penal battalion to advance frontally against the fortified position on Hill 102 to determine the volume and location of enemy fire. The unit was annihilated within 15 minutes. Selection for these battalions combined military and political criteria. A report from the NKVD's Special Department dated September 1942 indicates that 48% of those assigned to penal units were accused of cowardice or self-harm to evade combat, while 37% were suspected of defeatist expressions or anti-Soviet propaganda. The remaining 15% were common criminals and political prisoners who were offered redemption for their guilt in blood. Military field tribunals represented the third pillar of the repressive system. Operating directly on the front lines, these tribunals, composed of a political commissar, an NKVD officer, and a military commander, could issue death sentences that were carried out immediately. Military court records indicate that between August and November 1942, more than 1,200 soldiers were tried and shot by these mobile tribunals in the southern sector of Stalingrad alone. Court proceedings were extremely brief. A memorandum from the chief military prosecutor of the Stalingrad front states that cases must be resolved within 24 hours of the violation being reported and sentences carried out within 2 hours. Crimes that merited execution included not only desertion or surrender, but also minor infractions such as losing one's service weapon, sleeping on guard duty, or expressing doubts about the Soviet victory. A particularly well-documented case occurred on September 27, 1942, when the 64th Division Court ordered the execution of 17 soldiers who failed to report to the rendezvous point during a night counterattack. The subsequent investigation revealed that most had gotten lost in the darkness among the ruins, but the court deemed their absence to constitute dereliction of duty in combat. They were shot at dawn in front of their comrades as an example. The brutality of this repressive system was reflected in extreme cases of disciplinary fire. In September 1942, during a German attack on Mamayev Kurgan, an NKVD blocking detachment opened fire on an entire battalion of the retreating 282nd Infantry Regiment, killing more than 60 soldiers. The incident was recorded in the official report as armed measures to stem the retreat. This willingness to fire on friendly formations was supported by directives from the General Staff. A classified document from the 62nd Army's Operations Department, dated October 15, 1942, explicitly authorized the artillery to open fire on any concentration of Soviet uniforms retreating without authorization. The gunners were given tables of the exact coordinates of their own secondary defensive lines so they could direct corrective fire against them if necessary. NKVD units were not only responsible for preventing desertions, but also for monitoring political behavior. Reports from the Special Department document that approximately 500 Red Army officers were executed at Stalingrad for lack of offensive spirit or for allowing defeatist talk among their men. The case of Major Kuznetsov, shot on November 3, 1942, for refusing to report the escape of 5 men from his company, illustrates how even officers were not exempt from this surveillance. The psychological impact of these measures was profound. Personal diaries recovered from Soviet soldiers in Stalingrad reveal a constant fear not only of the German enemy but also of the Blue Jackets, a nickname for NKVD agents because of the color of their uniforms. A soldier of the 37th Guards Regiment wrote in October, "We are being shot at from the front by the Germans and from behind by our own men. We don't know where death will come from." The military effectiveness of this repressive system has been widely debated. Evaluation reports from the Defense Commissariat indicate that the desertion rate on the Stalingrad front decreased significantly between July and November 1942, falling from approximately 4,200 cases per week to less than 1,500. However, internal documents acknowledge that many units became operationally paralyzed by fear, unable to take tactical initiatives for fear of punitive interpretations of their actions. By January 1943, when the Soviet counteroffensive trapped the German Sixth Army, the repressive system had claimed at least 13,500 Soviet lives documented by formal executions, not counting deaths caused directly by fire from blocking detachments during combat. These figures represent a parallel battle, a Soviet war against its own soldiers, waged simultaneously with the fight against the German invader. The final macabre aspect of this system was public executions as a disciplinary spectacle. NKVD reports describe procedures where captured deserters were shot in front of their units before an attack to raise the fighting spirit of witnesses. A document from the political department of the 62nd Army, dated December 1942, reports the positive effects on fighting morale following the execution of 12 unstable elements in front of 400 soldiers. This dimension of the Battle of Stalingrad, a system of terror designed to force resistance through fear and coercion, reveals that for many Soviet soldiers, the city represented not only a battle against German fascism, but also a death trap where survival required facing the enemy because retreating meant certain death at one's own hands. Rot and cannibalism, physical deterioration in the enclosure. As the Russian winter of 1942 to 1943 tightened its relentless grip on Stalingrad, survival conditions for German fighters trapped in the Soviet encirclement deteriorated into the unthinkable. Extreme cold, systematic starvation, and the collapse of the medical infrastructure transformed the human body, both living and dead, into a spectacle of physical disintegration that defies modern understanding. According to data from Army Group B's Military Meteorological Service, temperatures in the Stalingrad area reached historic lows during December 1942, with readings as low as -35 degrees Celsius and daily averages rarely exceeding -25 degrees Celsius. January 1943 continued this brutal trend, with 18 consecutive days below -25 degrees Celsius, -20 degrees Celsius. Wehrmacht's most catastrophic logistical error was its failure to supply adequate winter equipment. Convinced that Stalingrad would fall before winter, German planners equipped the Sixth Army with lightweight autumn uniforms, unsuitable for the polar conditions they would face. Quartermaster reports for the Sixth Army, dated November 1942, show that only 10% of troops had the standard-issue thermal boots, while virtually no units had the special 3-layer gloves designed for Arctic operations. The medical consequences were immediate and devastating. Reports from the Sixth Army's Sanitätsdienst, medical service, reveal that between 25% and 32% of hospital casualties during December and January were directly due to severe frostbite leading to wet or dry gangrene. Unlike combat wounds, these cases could not be adequately treated due to critical shortages of medications, sterile conditions, and surgical equipment. Amputations became routine procedures performed under primitive conditions. The Kalak Field Hospital recorded 261 limb amputations between January 1st and 15th, 1943. Surgeons operating by candlelight or flashlights with nearly depleted batteries used carpenter's saws and surgical knives without proper disinfection. Morphine supplies ran out completely by the end of December, forcing doctors to resort to medieval methods. Patients were restrained with ropes and belts while remaining fully conscious during amputations. The most disturbing phenomenon was that decomposition began in soldiers who were still alive. Prolonged freezing of limbs caused tissue necrosis, while the individual remained conscious. Medical reports describe completely blackened fingers that detached upon slightest contact, ears that spontaneously disintegrated, and noses partially separated from the face. A doctor in the 76th Infantry Division documented cases where men lost parts of their limbs without realizing it, discovering upon removing their boots that several toes were still inside. Entire divisions were rendered operationally incapacitated due to physical immobilization caused by massive frostbite. Military Report Number 2118/42 of the Don Army Group describes the 305th Infantry Division as completely inoperable, with over 60% of its personnel suffering from severe frostbite and widespread gangrene. As the encirclement tightened and supplies were completely exhausted, documented cases of cannibalism began to emerge among the besieged German troops. These were not isolated incidents or rumors, but events meticulously documented by the Red Army following the German surrender. Interrogations conducted by the NKVD's Special Department of Captured Prisoners contained detailed confessions about organized cannibalistic practices in various sectors of the perimeter. Soviet reports meticulously documented findings of cannibalism among besieged German troops. A document from February 7, 1943, describes the discovery of a makeshift field hospital where partially dismembered bodies were found alongside evidence of preparation for human consumption. Skeletal remains with clean-cut marks in makeshift pots and fragments of human tissue mixed with bread to bulk up. Colonel Pyotr Kazakov, commander of the 3rd Medical Regiment, noted that the meat had been boiled together with moist bread and coffee residue, observing that the cuts on the bodies showed surgical precision, indicating anatomical knowledge in the removal of muscle tissue. Testimony from prisoners such as Corporal Franz Becker confirmed that when the last horses were consumed, his unit's medical staff began processing the bodies of soldiers who had recently died of hypothermia. Interrogations of German prisoners contain explicit testimony. Corporal Franz Becker, captured near Kallach, stated that in early January, when supplies had completely stopped arriving and the last horses were consumed, his unit's medical staff began suggesting the use of alternative resources. According to his testimony, at least 5 bodies of German soldiers who had recently died of hypothermia were processed and cooked on makeshift stoves. Final despair, suicides and mental breakdowns in recent days. The last 3 weeks of the siege of Stalingrad, between January 10th and February 2nd, 1943, represented the total collapse, physical, mental and moral, of the German 6th Army. What happened during this final phase transcends the conventional parameters of military history and enters a realm of unprecedented social and psychological disintegration. The German 6th Army archives held at the Bundesarchiv contain reports signed by General Staff officers between January 17th and 25th, 1943. These documents record at least 32 confirmed cases of officers choosing suicide in the face of impossibility of evacuation or imminent surrender. These were not impulsive acts, but methodical decisions made by commanders who understood the futility of their situation. The most emblematic case was that of General Major Alexander von Hartmann, commander of the 71st Division, who shot himself in the head on January 26th in the ruins of an administrative building. His suicide note, preserved in the military archives, stated, "I cannot conceive of living in a world where the Reich does not prevail. I would rather join my men in death than in humiliation." A similar fate befell Oberstleutnant Fritz Rosk, commander of the 94th Division, who blew himself up with a hand grenade inside his command post after receiving the formal surrender order from General Paulus. The verbal instructions distributed by the German High Command during the final days reflected the contradiction between military reality and ideological expectations. A document dated January 21, 1943, from Chief of Staff Friedrich Paulus, before his surrender, formally advised against suicide because it reduced fighting capacity, but in practice it was not condemned. Hitler's promotion of Paulus to Field Marshal on January 30th was correctly interpreted as an implicit message. No German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. The only honorable option was suicide. Nevertheless, Paulus chose to live and surrender, while many of his officers chose to die. The final attempts at air evacuation generated scenes of absolute chaos that descended into desperate violence. The Luftwaffe kept some improvised airfields operational until mid-January, mainly at Gumrak and Pitomnik. Operational reports from Luftflotte 4 detail that between January 12th and 21st, at least 19 serious incidents occurred during evacuations, mainly mass stampedes of soldiers desperate to board the aircraft. A particularly detailed report describes what happened on January 18th at the Gumrak airstrip. Approximately 200 wounded were awaiting orderly evacuation when a Heinkel Ha-111 appeared in for a landing. Immediately, some 40 unauthorized soldiers stormed the runway, ignoring gunfire from the Feldgendarmerie. The crowd surrounded the aircraft while it was still taxiing, attempting to force entry through the side hatches. The pilot aborted the takeoff, causing the aircraft to roll over as he attempted to turn under the excess weight in the cockpit. According to witnesses, several men were crushed to death by the wheels or the fuselage. Recent weeks have demonstrated a complete collapse of military discipline and the psychological stability of German troops. The archives of the 376th Division record at least 113 summary executions carried out by the Feldgendarmerie itself between January 10th and 29th for looting, assaulting superiors, or attempted desertion. Simultaneously, medical reports documented massive outbreaks of mass hysteria. On January 25th, Medical Officer Captain Erich Kraut described entire units in states of mental collapse, with soldiers screaming uncontrollably, laughing or crying without apparent stimulation, or displaying bizarre behaviors such as repeatedly biting a piece of metal as if it were food, symptoms caused by a combination of extreme malnutrition, prolonged sleep deprivation, inhuman temperatures, and the progressive loss of comrades. Conditions were ripe for mental collapse: extreme malnutrition, prolonged sleep deprivation, most slept less than 2 hours a night due to the cold and shelling, inhuman temperatures, and the progressive loss of close comrades. A classified document from the 6th Army's Military Medical Office dated January 28th. The capacity to treat these mass psychiatric disorders was virtually non-existent. The few surviving doctors lacked sedative or stabilizing medications. A report from Field Hospital No. 2 describes how psychotic patients were simply isolated in basement corners, often tied up or restrained with improvised straps, and left without human contact for days. In the final days, the chain of command began authorizing desperate measures to contain the widespread psychological collapse. Messages intercepted by Soviet intelligence and transcribed by the Smersh counterintelligence department indicate that on January 28th, orders were issued to immediately neutralize destabilizing elements spreading panic or ideas of surrender. By the end of January, internal German General Staff documents indicated that approximately 40% of operational units could not be considered militarily effective due to psychological or physical collapse. An Operations Department analysis dated January 29th estimated that only 18,000 of the approximately 90,000 men still alive within the encirclement retained basic fighting ability. In the final days of the encirclement, the disintegration of the German 6th Army was not only mental and logistical, but structural. Between January and February 1943, at least 12 German units, mainly infantry companies, were officially reported as missing without trace. These cases were not due to direct engagements or mass surrenders, but to the simple evaporation of entire groups in the chaos. Some of these units were found weeks later, frozen in the fetal position inside collapsed basements or dugouts. Others were never located, not even after extensive Soviet recovery campaigns that began in the spring. One documented case is that of the 8th Company of the 516th Regiment, attached to the 297th Division, which disappeared entirely during a repositioning attempt between the Red October factory and the Central Hospital. The last radio message was broadcast at 10:47 p.m. on January 18th. They were never heard from again. Their whereabouts are still being studied in German and Russian military archives. Orientation conditions were extreme, without accurate maps, with poor visibility due to smoke or snow, and with the front constantly shifting. It was common for units to get lost while crossing mined areas, unmarked ruins, or unrecorded firing lines. Some bodies of German soldiers were found weeks later by Soviet patrols several kilometers from the active front, in schoolyards, destroyed churches, or even civilian shelters, suggesting chaotic escape routes or haphazard decisions by commanders who were no longer mentally stable. The psychological collapse did not affect only the lower ranks. A German medical service document describes how, during the last General Staff conferences, several senior officers displayed obvious symptoms of advanced mental deterioration, incoherent speeches, planning impossible operations, or referring to non-existent units and resources. The report specifically singles out 2 colonels who continued to discuss plans to break the encirclement using phantom divisions and non-existent tanks, demonstrating a complete disconnect from reality. Hitler, in a final symbolic act that reflected his own disconnection from reality, sent a congratulatory message to the encircled Sixth Army on January 31st. "In these difficult times, my thoughts and those of the entire German people are with you. Everything in my power will be done to support you in your heroic struggle." By that time, most of the message's recipients were probably no longer able to comprehend its content. The broken High Command, Paulus, Schmidt and Seydlitz Kurzbach after the surrender. On January 31, 1943, Friedrich Paulus surrendered to the Red Army at the headquarters of the German Sixth Army, located in the basement of a department store in Stalingrad. He was accompanied by his Chief of Staff, General Arthur Schmidt, and liaison officer Wilhelm Adam. The surrender was not signed in a formal ceremony, but rather transmitted through verbal orders and radio confirmations intercepted by the Soviets. It was the first time in the history of the Third Reich that a field marshal surrendered alive to the enemy. Paulus's capture was interpreted by the German High Command as a betrayal. Hitler had promoted Paulus to the rank of field marshal the day before on January 30th, with the explicit intention of having him commit suicide. No German marshal had ever been captured before. Paulus refused. He was interrogated by Generals Rokossovsky and Voronov and taken to a dacha outside Moscow for isolation. During the initial interrogations, he remained reluctant to cooperate, limiting himself to confirming operational information already known to the Soviet General Staff. Arthur Schmidt, considered one of the most hardline officers on the Stalingrad General Staff, was also captured that day. According to NKVD archives, Schmidt maintained a hostile attitude during interrogations, refusing to acknowledge strategic errors and blaming logistical conditions. He was interned with other senior German officers in a special prison camp in Krasnogorsk. He did not participate in any propaganda efforts or collaborate with the National Committee for a Free Germany. General Walter von Seydlitz Kurzbach, commander of the LI Army Corps at Stalingrad, surrendered on 25 January before Paulus's surrender. After his capture, he was interrogated by GRU officers. Unlike other generals, von Seydlitz openly expressed his opposition to Hitler and the course of the war. In May 1943, he requested in writing permission to form a committee of German prisoners to publicly appeal to his former subordinates and officers. This request led to the founding of the National Committee for a Free Germany (NKFD), backed by Soviet intelligence. The NKFD was officially launched in July 1943. It was formed by officers captured at Stalingrad and other eastern fronts. Von Seydlitz became one of its prominent figures. His participation generated conflict within the group of prisoners. Some accused him of collaboration, while others joined the radio campaigns aimed at eroding German morale. The broadcasts included direct messages to units on the Eastern Front and leaflets dropped by air. In Germany, Paulus's surrender and von Seydlitz's actions provoked an immediate backlash. The Reich Tribunal declared them traitors in absentia. Their families were arrested, their property confiscated, and their names removed from official records. The Gestapo ordered their profiles erased from military personnel files. In August 1944, Hitler signed a decree stripping von Seydlitz of his rank and German citizenship. Paulus remained in captivity for almost a decade. In 1944, he refused to join the NKFD but agreed to testify against the Nazi regime during the Nuremberg trials in 1946 as a prosecution witness against Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl. His testimony about the planning of Operation Barbarossa and the siege of Stalingrad was used by the Soviet prosecution. He was released in 1953, following Stalin's death, and settled in Dresden in the German Democratic Republic. He died in 1957 under the surveillance of the Ministry for State Security. Arthur Schmidt was released in 1955 after refusing any cooperation with the Soviets. He returned to West Germany and made no further public statements about his role in the battle. He died in 1987. Walter von Seydlitz remained in the USSR until 1955. Upon his return to East Germany, he was rejected by the authorities of the new regime, who distrusted his conservative views. He settled in Bremen, West Germany. He died in 1976 without regaining his military rank or his German nationality. The surrender of these three generals not only marked the operational end of the Sixth Army, it also opened a rift within the German military establishment. For the first time, high-ranking officers publicly broke their personal oath to Hitler. This rupture didn't change the course of the war, but it set a precedent. At Stalingrad, obedience was no longer absolute. Memory of the ruins, nameless bodies, and eternal scars. When the echo of the last shots died away in Stalingrad on February 2, 1943, it did not mark the end of the battle, but rather the beginning of a new chapter, the confrontation with the shocking physical reality it had left behind. A city reduced to skeletons of concrete and steel held the remains of one of the greatest carnages in modern history. The first systematic exhumations began in the spring of 1945, once the overall situation on the Eastern Front allowed for the allocation of resources to these tasks. The USSR State Committee for Defense assigned specialized Red Army units and forensic teams from the Ministry of Public Health to begin the recovery of bodies, starting with the most critical locations where the greatest concentration of corpses was estimated. According to reports filed under Index 345/C12 of the Soviet Ministry of Defense, more than 16,000 bodies, both Soviet and German, were recovered during that first year. The process immediately revealed the magnitude of the challenge. Most of the remains were unrecognizable, having been fragmented by explosions, burned by fires, or had suffered advanced decomposition after more than 2 years of exposure to the elements. According to documents from the Volgograd, formerly Stalingrad Medical Legal Institute, only 4% of the remains exhumed during 1945 to 46 could be positively identified using dog tags, personal documents, or recognizable belongings. The remainder were classified with sequential numbers and buried in mass graves, often without distinction as to nationality or military affiliation. The largest concentrations of human remains were found in areas that had been the scene of particularly intense fighting. Mamayev Kurgan, the strategic hill that changed hands multiple times during the battle, yielded more than 17,000 bodies between 1945 and 1980. Recovery teams found entire trenches where human remains had fused with the terrain, forming compact layers of bones, military equipment, and hardened earth. The city's industrial complex, comprised of the Barricadi, Red October, and tractor factories, housed another mass concentration of victims. More than 11,400 bodies were recovered in these areas between 1947 and 1991. The industrial characteristics of these spaces created unique preservation conditions. Many bodies were sealed between collapsed floors or in basements flooded with industrial oil, which delayed their decomposition and created what forensic scientists called accidental mummification. The area surrounding Pavlov's house, the famous building tenaciously defended by a small group of Soviet soldiers, revealed approximately 3,800 bodies in its immediate vicinity, many of them non-evacuated civilians who had sought refuge in the basements. Forensic reports indicate that most died of asphyxiation when the fires consumed the oxygen available in the enclosed spaces. Recovery campaigns continued throughout the decades. In the 1970s, coinciding with the 30th anniversary of the Soviet victory, a special operation was undertaken in the central sectors of the city. This effort revealed an additional 7,200 bodies, many compacted into improvised graves during the winter of 1942 to 43. Field reports describe particularly disturbing findings. Bodies frozen in fetal positions, corpses still embracing each other, and children's remains next to adults, presumably mothers trying to protect their children until the end. Each exhumation provided valuable information not only about identities but also about the precise circumstances of death and the extreme conditions that characterized the battle. The reports of the Cemetery Reconstruction Committee, CRVO, detail the objects found alongside the remains. German military dog tags, Erkennungsmark, often fragmented by impacts or corroded by prolonged exposure. Partially preserved uniforms, especially those of Soviet troops, whose resistant fabrics and the dry climate of the Russian winter allowed the preservation of insignia and rank markings. Complete boots containing skeletal remains of feet, preserved in pits sealed by rubble or in dry cellars. Charred personal documents, Soviet internal passports, party books, military cards, many with legible names that allowed for late identifications. Personal objects such as family photographs, letters, watches, and wedding rings, which humanized the anonymous remains. Forensic analysis made it possible to classify the predominant causes of death among those exhumed, offering a statistical profile of the nature of the combat in Stalingrad. Explosive wounds, grenade fragmentation, artillery, 38% close-range projectile impacts, sniper, direct fire, 26% frostbite without visible trauma, 19% puncture wounds or mutilations indicative of close combat, 11% signs of chronic infection, severe malnutrition or disease, 6%. These data confirm that, although direct combat caused the majority of deaths, nearly a fifth of the victims simply succumbed to extreme cold without sustaining combat wounds, a silent testimony to the inhuman conditions that prevailed during the winter of 1942–43. Not all recovered bodies received formal burial. Documents from the Russian Federation's Department of Military Heritage indicate that at least 8,000 remains were declared unrecoverable due to their level of decomposition or fragmentation. These remained in situ, symbolically marked in areas where it was impossible to distinguish human remains from other organic material. The recovery operations had a significant psychological impact on later generations. Reports from exhumation teams describe intense reactions among workers, documented cases of recurring nightmares, sudden alcoholism, and abandonment of work after particularly disturbing discoveries such as children's graves or evidence of extreme suffering before death. Beginning in 1991, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the paradigm shifted. Civilian organizations such as Volgograd Without a Name began new search campaigns, motivated less by state obligations and more by humanitarian and family considerations. These initiatives located at least 500 additional bodies annually in the rural areas around Stalingrad, where the fighting had been less intense but equally deadly. The final disposition of the recovered remains varied significantly. While identifiable bodies were transferred to official cemeteries such as Rososhki, 35 kilometers from the city, which houses more than 56,000 German and Soviet remains, or the Mamayev-Kurgan Memorial Complex with its symbolic grave of 30,000 mostly unidentified Soviet soldiers, documents from the Department of Military Heritage indicate that at least 8,000 remains were declared irrecoverable due to their extreme level of decomposition or fragmentation. These remained in situ, symbolically marked in areas where it was impossible to distinguish human remains from other organic material. The Battle of Stalingrad did not end in February 1943. Its physical consequences, manifested in the thousands of bodies that continue to emerge from the bowels of the earth decades later, represent a tangible reminder that conflicts do not end with the last shot. The modern city, although rebuilt and transformed, preserves in its subsoil the silent testimony of those who perished among its ruins. Every discovery, every belated identification, every recovered personal object constitutes not only additional historical data, but an act of restoring dignity to those whose lives were consumed in one of the most devastating battles humanity has ever known.